The sun hung low over Dust Valley, burning the horizon into a reddish haze as a stranger rode into town. His horse limped, dust caked on its legs, and his face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen too many miles. No one in Dust Valley liked strangers, especially ones who didn't talk much. He dismounted outside the saloon, asked for water for his horse, and a room for himself. The barkeep, a heavy man with tired eyes, gave him both, but not without suspicion. The stranger didn't speak his name. He just sat in silence, drinking coffee, scanning faces. When two little twin girls ran past the saloon window, giggling as they chased a rolling hoop, he couldn't help but glance. They looked maybe 5 or 6, wearing matching blue dresses and ribbons. Moments later, a horse-drawn wagon came hurtling down the main road, out of control. The driver had fallen from the seat, reins whipping wildly. The twins stood frozen in the middle of the path. Before anyone could shout, the stranger was already moving. He sprinted, dove forward, and pulled the girls clear just as the wagon thundered past, crashing into a trough. Dust filled the air, people screamed, and when it settled, the stranger was on the ground, holding both girls tightly. The sheriff arrived moments later, panting, hat crooked. "You saved them," he said, clapping the stranger's shoulder. "Dust Valley owes you a drink, or a favor. Hell, choose any woman you want, and I'll marry you by sundown." The crowd laughed. It was the kind of rough, teasing humor the town was known for. The stranger gave no reply, only set the girls down gently. But then, as he started to walk away, the twins turned to each other, eyes wide and uncertain. One whispered something, the other nodded. Then they both pointed toward the stranger and said in perfect unison, "Papa, that's her." The laughter stopped. The sheriff's smile faded. The barkeep froze mid-pour. Everyone turned to look at the twins, then at the stranger, and finally at a woman standing across the street, a quiet widow in a gray dress. Evelyn Moore. She dropped the basket she was holding, fruit spilling into the dust. The sound of apples hitting the ground was the only noise in the world at that moment. The stranger's eyes locked on hers, cold and searching, as though looking through time. Evelyn's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She turned abruptly and walked away, almost stumbling. The stranger didn't follow. He just watched her go, then tipped his hat to the twins, his jaw tightening as though fighting the weight of a memory too heavy to bear. That night, Dust Valley buzzed with whispers. Who was he? Why did the twins call him Papa? Why had Evelyn looked so frightened? The sheriff tried to laugh it off in the saloon, but even he couldn't shake the unease. The stranger had saved lives, yet brought ghosts with him. Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat by her window, staring into the desert night. She had buried her past long ago, or thought she had. But when she saw that man's face, something deep inside her cracked open. He looked like someone she'd lost, or perhaps someone she'd betrayed. By morning, the stranger was still in town. He sat on the church steps as the twins played nearby, their laughter echoing down the dusty street. Evelyn came out of the general store, saw him there, and froze again. The sheriff stepped beside her. "He says he's just passing through," the sheriff murmured. "But I think he's looking for someone." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the bread she was holding. "Then I hope he finds them quickly," she whispered. The sheriff studied her face. "You know him." She looked away, her eyes glistening. "Once," she said softly. "A long time ago. Before Dust Valley. Before I was Evelyn Moore." The stranger watched her from across the street, the wind carrying the faint laughter of the twins between them. In his hand, he held an old photograph. A woman who looked just like Evelyn, standing beside 2 infants. On the back, in fading ink, were the words, "My family, lost in the fire." And in that moment, both Evelyn and the stranger knew. Neither of them was who the town believed. Dust Valley wasn't big enough to hide the truth forever. The morning came with a dry wind that swept through Dust Valley, carrying the scent of smoke and sand. The stranger had taken to sleeping in the church barn, and by now, the whole town was whispering his name, though no one knew what it was. Some called him the ghost, others the rider. What mattered was that he wasn't just passing through anymore. He stayed close to the twins, not in a way that frightened anyone, but as if their laughter anchored him to the earth. Evelyn, however, avoided him at all costs. The sheriff couldn't ignore the tension any longer. He found the stranger by the water trough, polishing an old revolver, the metal worn to dull silver. "You've been here a while," the sheriff said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "You planning on moving on, or are you here for someone?" The stranger didn't look up. "I'm looking for my family," he said quietly. "They were taken from me 5 years ago. A raid on the Red Creek settlement. My wife, my daughters." The sheriff frowned. Red Creek was a name people in these parts avoided. It had been burned to ashes in an Indian raid mixed with bandits. Few survived, and those who did vanished into the wilderness. "You think someone here knows what happened?" The stranger's gaze lifted toward the general store across the street, where Evelyn was tending to her chores. "I don't think," he said. "I know." That night, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He pulled out old records from the town archive, back when Dust Valley was still called Franklin's Hollow. The handwriting was faded, but one entry caught his eye. A woman named Anna Ward, arrived 4 years ago with 2 small girls, changed her name to Evelyn Moore shortly after. No family, no history before that. The sheriff poured himself a whiskey and stared at the page until the candle burned low. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat alone by her fireplace, clutching a locket with 2 tiny portraits, one of the twins, and one of a man whose face she had tried so hard to forget. The same man who now slept in the church barn. Her heart twisted with guilt. She had taken that locket from the ashes the night Red Creek burned. She hadn't meant to lie, she had meant to survive. The next day, the stranger approached the sheriff again. "You told me to choose any woman I want," he said, his voice low and steady. "I choose the truth." The sheriff met his gaze. "Careful what you dig up. Around here, the truth's buried for a reason." By noon, the sheriff rode out to the edge of town, to the spot where the old trail led to Red Creek's ruins. He wanted to see for himself. He found burnt timbers, broken wagons, and bones half buried under sand. Among them, a rusted pendant, the same design as the locket Evelyn wore. He rode back with a heaviness in his chest. When he returned, Evelyn was waiting on his porch. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I found what you left behind," he said softly. "And I found the man who's come to claim it." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "He doesn't understand. He thinks I stole his life. But I saved those girls. His real wife, she didn't make it. I took her name to protect them. I had nothing else." The sheriff looked away. "Does he know that?" She shook her head. "Not yet. And I don't think he'll care." That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the sheriff met the stranger outside the saloon. The townsfolk watched from their porches, whispering. "You were right," the sheriff said, voice grim. "Evelyn Moore isn't who she says she is." The stranger's eyes burned. "Then she'll tell me what she did with my wife." The sheriff sighed. "Before you do something foolish, remember, she raised your girls when no one else would. You can choose anger. Or you can choose to listen." The stranger stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dirt. "You told me once to choose any woman I want," he said quietly. "I'm not choosing a woman, Sheriff. I'm choosing justice." The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw. The air between them tightened like a drawn rope. In that breathless silence, the twins ran out from the boarding house, calling for their mother. The stranger froze. For a moment, his hard eyes softened, then hardened again. Dust Valley was about to learn that truth was more dangerous than any gunfight. And before the night was over, someone would bleed for it. The sky over Dust Valley turned the color of ash as the storm rolled in from the plains. The air felt heavy, charged with something more than just thunder. Evelyn sat in the church, her hands clasped so tight around her locket that her knuckles turned white. The sheriff stood near the doorway, watching her in silence. Outside, the twins played quietly under the eaves, their laughter dimmed by the wind. "He deserves to know," the sheriff said at last. "You can't keep running from it, Evelyn." She looked up at him, eyes hollow. "You think I don't know that? Every time I look at those girls, I see her face." His wife's face. "The night Red Creek burned, I wasn't supposed to survive. She was. But fate made a cruel mistake." The sheriff frowned. "Tell me everything. From the start." Evelyn took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began. "I was with the wagon train when it was attacked. Bandits, maybe raiders, I never knew. The sky was on fire, people screaming. I found her in the wreckage, the real Evelyn Ward. She was dying, holding those babies in her arms. She begged me to save them, to tell her husband they lived. I tried, God knows I tried, but when I went back for him, everything was gone. I thought he was dead. I took her name to protect the children. I thought no one would ever come looking." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "But he did." She nodded slowly. "And now he's here." The stranger walked into the church just as lightning split the sky. His coat was soaked, his hat shadowing his face. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his gun, but the man raised his palm. "I'm not here to fight," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. "I just want the truth." Evelyn rose to her feet, tears spilling freely. "You deserve that," she whispered. "And more." She told him everything, about the fire, about his wife's last words, about how she buried her under the old oak by the creek. The stranger's eyes glistened, though his face stayed stone still. When she finished, he turned away, shoulders trembling. "You took her name," he said. "You raised my daughters. You lied to me for 5 years. I lied to save them," she said. "And to save myself. But I never stopped being sorry." He didn't answer. He walked to the doorway and looked out into the storm, where the twins were chasing the rain, laughing in the mud. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he holstered his gun and stepped outside. The sheriff sighed, leaning against a pew. "He's not going to kill you," he said softly. "But he's not the same man he was." Evelyn wiped her face. "Neither am I." When the storm passed, Dust Valley felt strangely quiet. The next morning, the stranger stood at the edge of town, hat in hand, watching the sun rise over the hills. The sheriff joined him, hands in his pockets. "So," he said, "what now?" The man smiled faintly. "I buried my wife last night. Said what needed to be said. The rest, I'll leave to God." "And the girls?" the sheriff asked. He turned to look back toward the little house where the twins slept. Evelyn stood on the porch, watching them from the doorway. "They've got a mother who loves them," he said softly. "Maybe that's enough. They don't need to know every sin their parents made." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You're leaving, then?" The man mounted his horse, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. "Not running," he said. "Just riding toward peace." As he started down the trail, the twins burst from the house, barefoot and laughing. "Papa," they called, their voices carrying through the morning air. He turned, his throat tightening, and smiled. "Be good for your mama," he said. Evelyn watched him disappear into the horizon until he was nothing but a shadow in the dust. Her tears came not from grief, but from something deeper, release. She turned and walked inside, where the twins were waiting for breakfast. The sheriff stood by the gate, tipping his hat. "Dust Valley's quieter without him," he muttered. Evelyn smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Dust Valley's finally at peace." That evening, the wind carried the scent of rain again, and for the first time in years, it felt like a blessing. The stranger never returned, but sometimes, when the twins played by the old oak tree, they swore they could hear a horse's soft gallop in the distance, like their father was still watching, still guarding them from the shadows of the past.